Welcome to my channel.
The snow didn't fall in Lochdubh so much as it staged an occupation. It drifted down in heavy, wet flakes that turned the peaks of Sullivan into jagged white teeth and muffled the world in a deceptive, chilly silence. For PC Hamish Macbeth, the weather was a blessing. It meant the roads from Strathbane were treacherous, the tourists were safely tucked away in the south, and most importantly, Detective Chief Inspector Blair was unlikely to venture out of his overheated office to harass the local constabulary. Hamish sat in the kitchen of the police station, his long, gangly legs stretched out toward the peat fire. His red hair was ruffled, and his hazel eyes were fixed with intense concentration on a thick slice of toast dripping with salty butter. At his feet, Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed and even more indeterminate temper, let out a long, whistling sigh that mirrored his master's contentment. The telephone in the hallway began to ring. Its shrill, insistent tone cut through the peace like a blunt saw. Hamish didn't move. He took a slow, deliberate bite of his toast. "If it's important, they'll call back," he murmured to Lugs. "And if it's Blair, he'll just be wanting to know why I haven't filed the report on Mrs. Gillespie's missing cat. The cat's no missing, it's just staying with the widower down the road for the warmth." "Cats have more sense than people, Lugs." The phone stopped. A moment later it started again. With a groan that suggested he was being asked to climb the Matterhorn in his slippers, Hamish stood up. He didn't answer the phone. Instead, he reached for his heavy greatcoat and his peaked cap. If he wasn't in the station, he couldn't be blamed for not answering. He slipped out the back door and into the biting Highland air. His plan was simple, a patrol that would take him exactly as far as the Lochdubh Hotel, where a pot of coffee and perhaps a bit of gossip from Mrs. Emma Grant would be waiting. However, the peace of the village had recently been contaminated by the arrival of Mr. Julian Vane Temperley. Julian was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety, a retired London hedge fund manager with a voice like a foghorn and a wardrobe consisting entirely of pristine neon-coloured outdoor gear that had never seen a speck of real Highland mud. Julian had purchased the old McRae estate on the edge of the loch. He had spent the last 3 weeks complaining about the lack of high-speed internet, the primitive state of the local grocery, and the fact that the sun dared to set before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As Hamish crunched through the snow toward the hotel, a silver Range Rover, looking far too clean for the Sutherland roads, skidded to a halt beside him, spraying slush over Hamish's boots. The window slid down with a smooth electric hum. Julian Vane Temperley poked his head out. His face was a healthy, expensive shade of pink, and he was wearing a cashmere scarf that probably cost more than Hamish earned in a month. "I say, Macbeth," Julian barked. "I've been trying to reach the station. Do you people never work? I want to report a trespasser." Hamish adjusted his cap, his face settling into the expression of vacant, helpful stupidity he reserved for people he particularly disliked. "A trespasser, is it, Mr. Vane Temperley? In this weather? Most folk are staying by the fire." "I saw a man," Julian insisted, tapping his leather-clad steering wheel, "down by the old jetty. Scruffy fellow. Looked like he was carrying a long bag. Probably poaching. I won't have it, Macbeth. I've paid a fortune for the riparian rights. I want him arrested. I want an example made." Hamish looked toward the loch. He knew exactly who was at the jetty. It was old Geordie, likely trying to snag a late-season salmon for his Christmas dinner. Hamish had planned to not see Geordie himself later that evening. "The jetty, you say?" Hamish scratched his chin slowly. "Ah, that'll be the ghost, sir." Julian blinked. "The what?" "The ghosts of the Spanish sailors," Hamish said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They come ashore when the snow is heavy, looking for their lost gold. Best to leave them be, Mr. Vane Temperley. They have a nasty habit of cursing the engines of expensive cars." Julian's mouth went thin. "Don't be ridiculous. This isn't some folklore theme park. It's my property. If you won't do your job, I'll call your superiors in Strathbane. I believe I have DCI Blair's direct line." Hamish's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well now, sir, if you feel the need to bother the DCI with a man walking on a beach, that's your right. But the roads are a bit slick. It would be a shame if your big car ended up in the ditch while you were looking for him." Julian huffed, rolled up the window, and roared off toward his estate, the tyres spinning uselessly for a second before catching. Hamish watched him go, his relaxed mood beginning to sour. Men like Julian Vane Temperley were like a bad cold. They didn't just annoy you, they got under your skin and made everything ache. Ghosts, lugs, Hamish sighed, looking down at the dog. I wish they were ghosts. Real ghosts don't call the chief inspector. He turned his collar up against the wind. He didn't know it yet, but Julian Vane Temperley wouldn't be complaining about trespassers for much longer. And Hamish's quiet, lazy Christmas was about to be buried under something much colder than snow. The warmth of the Lochdubh Hotel was a physical embrace. The scent of wood smoke, wet wool, and Mrs. Grant's legendary scones acted as a temporary shield against the winter. Hamish took his usual seat in the corner, near the radiator that clanked with a reassuring thud. Mrs. Grant appeared with a heavy stoneware mug of coffee. "He's been by?" she asked, her voice lowered. "The English gentleman in the silver tank." "He has," Hamish replied, wrapping his large hands around the mug. "Demanding I arrest the wind for blowing. Cross his driveway. He's a man who won't be happy until he's paved the Highlands and charged us all a toll for walking." Mrs. Grant sighed. "He's the type to find flaws too, Hamish." Hamish had just raised the mug to his lips when the door was flung open with violence. The freezing wind screamed into the lobby, bringing a distraught Archie McLean. Archie was the village's handyman, generally known for his stoicism. Now his face was the colour of curdled milk. "Hamish! You've got to come," Archie gasped. "It's the Vane Temperley place. Now, man." Hamish felt a leaden weight settle in him. The coffee would have to wait. "What's he done now, Archie? Has he tripped over his ego?" "No, Hamish," Archie whispered. "He's dead, and it's no right at all." With a lingering look at his mug, Hamish stood up. He whistled for Lugs. The dog followed him out into the whiteout, looking just as disgruntled as his master. The walk to the estate was a grueling struggle, against a wind that felt like a razor against the skin. When they arrived, the gates were wide open, the silver Range Rover still idling, its headlights cutting twin tunnels through the falling snow. Following Archie around to the back, Hamish found himself in the middle of Julian's winter wonderland, a garish display of plastic reindeer and laser snowflakes that felt alien against the rugged Scottish hills. The silence of the garden was eerie, broken only by the rhythmic blinking of the lights. In the centre of the lawn stood a massive synthetic Christmas tree, glowing with thousands of heartless blue LED lights. It was a scene from a nightmare, lit by a disco, and there, at the base, lay Julian Vane Temperley. He was dressed in his orange expedition jacket, slumped against the plastic trunk, his eyes bulging. Wrapped tightly around his neck in clinical loops was a strand of the blue lights that were blinking in a festive sequence. Hamish took a deep, steadying breath, the air burning his lungs. "I came to finish." "The wiring," Archie stammered. "I saw the lights flickering. I thought it was a short. Then I saw him." Hamish knelt in the snow, his knees cracking. He looked tired, his face a mask of dull indifference, but his eyes were darting everywhere. He noted the snow hadn't yet covered the body, suggesting Julian hadn't been dead for more than half an hour. He looked at the knots. They weren't the messy tangles of a man who had tripped. They were precise, professional, and chillingly deliberate. Lugs wandered over, sniffed Julian's expensive leather boots, and let out a low, mournful howl that echoed across the silent lawn. "Quiet, Lugs," Hamish murmured, patting the dog's cold, damp head. Hamish noticed a peculiar detail. Julian was clutching a single crumpled piece of old paper. It looked like a fragment of a musical score, specifically the bars of A Christmas Carol. Hamish stood up, brushing snow from his trousers. His peace was gone. The quiet Christmas he had planned was officially dead, replaced by a crime as flamboyant and irritating as the victim himself. He knew the phone lines to Strathbane would be buzzing. DCI Blair would be salivating at the chance to scream at him for ruining his own holiday. "Archie," Hamish said softly, "go to the kitchen. Tell the staff to stay put, and don't touch any of these lights. I suspect Vane Temperley found something in the Highlands he can't complain his way out of." As he stood there, the blue lights blinking against the white snow, Hamish Macbeth looked less like a village policeman and more like a man who had just seen a very complicated puzzle fall onto his lap. He hated puzzles. They required effort. And as the distant sound of a police siren began to wail, he knew the effort was only just beginning. The Sassenach had brought his London drama to Lochdubh, and Hamish would have to be the one to clean up the mess before Blair arrived to make things worse than they were in this frozen dark corner of the cold Highlands hills. The heavy snow clung to his police uniform, as if trying to freeze him before the loud circus started. He could almost see Blair's face already, screaming about incompetence while the snow continued to bury the truth under a white sheet. The siren's wail grew from a distant, mournful cry into a shrill, bone-rattling scream that tore through the muffled silence of the falling snow. Blue lights, far more aggressive than the festive ones currently strangling Julian Vane Temperley, pulsed against the dark pines as 2 police cruisers from Strathbane skidded into the estate's driveway. Before the lead vehicle had even come to a full, shuddering halt, the driver's side door was opened. Detective Chief Inspector Blair tumbled out like a sack of potatoes. His face was a vivid shade of crimson that seemed to vibrate against the backdrop of the white Highlands. He looked as though he had been dragged away from a warm pub fire, and his mood was clearly as foul as the freezing sleet now beginning to lash against his bald head. Behind him, Detective Jimmy Anderson stepped out more tentatively, shivering and immediately pulling his coat collar up to his ears, looking with disgust at the deep slush. "Macbeth!" Blair's voice boomed across the lawn, loud enough to startle a deer 3 miles away in the glen. "You lazy, red-headed Highland peasant." "I knew it. I knew the moment the call came through to the station that you'd be standing here with your hands in your pockets while a crime scene turned into a bloody Highland picnic. Look at you, just standing there. Have you touched anything? Have you ruined the forensic integrity of this entire county with your bumbling, thick-headed incompetence?" Hamish Macbeth didn't flinch. He adjusted his cap with a slow, deliberate movement that suggested he was trying to remember what a forensic was. His face settled into a mask of placid, vacant helpfulness. "Good evening to you too, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a thick, rhythmic lilt. "I was just making sure the dog didn't wander off. It's a cold night for a murder, is it no? The poor gentleman there has had a bit of a turn with his decorations." Blair stomped across the lawn, his heavy boots obliterating several clear footprints in the snow that Hamish had been carefully trying to memorize. He reached the base of the glowing blue synthetic tree and looked down at Julian's body. He snorted, a sound of pure derision. "A turn? The man's been garroted by a 5-pound string of Woolworth's lights, Macbeth. It's a mockery. Look at him. It's pathetic." Blair turned his gaze toward Archie McLean, who was still shivering by the garage. "And who's this?" "That's Archie, sir," Hamish said softly. "The handyman. He's the one who found him. He was coming to check the wiring." "Handyman, eh?" Blair stepped toward Archie, looming over the smaller man. "Convenient, isn't it? You come to check the wiring and find the man who pays your wages strangled by the very wires you're supposed to be fixing. Maybe he didn't pay you enough, McLean? Or maybe you just didn't like his accent?" "I didn't do nothing," Archie stammered, his eyes wide. "I just saw the lights flickering, sir. I swear on the Bible." "We'll see about that," Blair snapped. He turned back to the body, ignoring the snow that was now piling up on Julian's orange jacket. "It's obvious. A local grudge. Probably a dispute over a fence or a stray sheep. These people are all the same, primitive, violent over the smallest pittance." Hamish cleared his throat. A small, tentative sound. "Sir, I noticed something. In his hand. It's a bit of paper. Looks like music." Blair bent down, squinting through the blue glare of the LEDs. He saw the crumpled fragment of the musical score clutched in Julian's stiff fingers. He scoffed loudly, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the mansion. "Music? You think this is an opera, Macbeth? It's probably a receipt for the tree, or a shopping list. It's rubbish. Don't. Go trying to make this into some grand mystery. It's a common assault that went too far. Anderson, get the tape up, and get this handyman into the car. I want him in a cell in Strathbane before the roads freeze over." "But sir," Hamish persisted, his tone sounding increasingly apologetic. "The knots are very tight, very professional, almost like a sailor would tie, or someone who knows their way around a rope." Blair turned on him, his finger jabbing into Hamish's chest. "I don't pay you to think, Macbeth. In fact, I don't think I pay you to do anything at all. You're a shepherd in a blue suit. You are dismissed from this scene, Macbeth. Go back to your cold station and stay there until I call. Leave the detection to the professionals. And for God's sake, clear off with that mangy, flea-bitten stray Highland dog. Do you hear me, you useless piece of wood?" Hamish watched the taillights of the police van disappear into the swirling white void taking a terrified Archie MacLean toward a cold cell in Strathbane. Blair's insults still hung in the frigid air like frozen breath, but Hamish didn't let them sting. Being called a useless peasant was a small price to pay for being left alone to do the real work. He whistled low for Lugs, who was busy investigating a discarded sandwich wrapper near the Range Rover, and began the long, quiet trudge back toward the heart of Lochdubh. The village was a cluster of dim yellow lights, huddling against the darkness of the glen, and Hamish knew that by now every telephone in the parish would be red-hot with the news of the Sassenach's spectacular demise. He didn't go back to the police station. Instead, he made his way to the village shop and post office, a place where information was traded more frequently than stamps or half-pints of milk. Mrs. Wellington, the postmistress and wife of the local minister, was already behind the counter. Her spectacles perched on the tip of her nose as she rearranged a display of tinned peas. With unnecessary vigour. The bell above the door gave a cheerful tinkle that felt entirely out of place given the grim business at the Vane Temple estate. The shop smelled of floor wax, peppermint, and the faint metallic tang of the paraffin heater humming in the corner. "It's a terrible thing, Hamish," she began, not even looking up from her peas. "A terrible, bright, blinking thing. To be found in such a state, like a common criminal. And poor Archie. My husband says Blair is a man with the soul of a blunt instrument. You shouldn't have let him take the boy, Hamish. He's as innocent as a newborn lamb." Hamish leaned against the counter, his frame looking even more skeletal in the harsh fluorescent light of the shop. "Ah, you know how it is, Mrs. Wellington. When the big dogs bark, the sheep must move. I'm just a simple village bobby. What would I know about the grand designs of Strathbane?" He let out a long, weary sigh, one that usually prompted a sympathetic offering from the locals. It worked. Mrs. Wellington's face softened, and she reached for the kettle in the back room. "You look perish, man. Sit down. I've some ginger cake that's just on the edge of going dry, and a pot of tea will do you more good than staring at snow." Hamish took his seat on a rickety stool, Lugs settling at his feet with a grunt of satisfaction. As the tea was poured, Hamish began his mooching in earnest. He didn't ask about the murder directly, that was too clumsy. Instead, he talked about the weather, the upcoming Christmas service, and Julian Vane Temple's unfortunate habit of complaining about everything. He was a man who liked to make enemies for the sport of it, Mrs. Wellington remarked, handing him a thick slice of cake. "Did you know he was trying to buy the old Kirk Hall? Wanted to turn it into a private gym," he said. "My husband was devastated. He told Mr. Vane Temple that the hall was for the community, but that man just laughed. He said money speaks louder than hymns. A very cold man, Hamish. Very cold." Hamish chewed slowly, the ginger cake warming his throat. He was a great one for the music, then. Music? Not a bit of it. He hated the choir practice. Said the singing was atonal screeching and threatened to call the council about the noise. Only last week, he had a blazing row with that new fellow, Mr. Latimer, who's been staying at the hotel. Latimer is a musician, you know. A conductor from London, very refined, very sensitive. Hamish's ears pricked up, though his expression remained one of dull contentment. A conductor, and what would a London conductor be doing in Lochdubh during a blizzard? Resting his nerves, apparently, but Julian didn't give him much peace. They were seen shouting at each other on the pier. Something about a lost manuscript or an old debt. Mr. Latimer looked like he wanted to drown the man in the loch. Hamish finished his tea and stood up, thanking her for the fine hospitality. He moved back out into the cold. He had a name now, Latimer. He walked toward the Lochdubh Hotel, his mind turning over the image of the musical score in Julian's hand. He needed to see this conductor, and he needed to do it before Blair realized that the useless peasant was already miles ahead of the official investigation. The snow continued to fall, burying the village in a white silence. He looked at Lugs, whose fur was tipped with frost, and realized the night was far from over for either of them. The Highland air was thick with more than just ice. It was heavy with the scent of a very old, very musical grudge. The walk from the post office to the Lochdubh Hotel was a battle against a northerly blast that seemed determined to peel the skin from Hamish's cheekbones. The snow was no longer falling in gentle flakes. It was a stinging horizontal assault that turned the world into a grey and white blur. Lugs kept close to Hamish's heels, his ears flattened against his head, both man and dog sharing a singular, desperate focus on the golden light spilling from the hotel's tall windows. As Hamish pushed through the heavy oak doors, the sudden silence and warmth were almost disorienting. He shook himself like a wet spaniel, sending a spray of icy meltwater across the expensive Persian rug, a sight that would have sent the manager, Mr. Johnson, into a fit of apoplexy. Fortunately, the lobby was nearly empty, save for a figure standing by the fireplace that made Hamish's heart do a small, uncomfortable somersault. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was the daughter of the local squire, and to Hamish, she was the personification of everything beautiful and unattainable in the Highlands. She was standing with a glass of sherry in her hand, the firelight dancing in her pale blonde hair and reflecting in eyes that always seemed to be looking at Hamish, with a mixture of genuine affection and weary exasperation. She was dressed in a tailored tweed skirt and a silk blouse that cost more than Hamish's entire winter wardrobe, looking perfectly composed while he stood there, dripping, red-faced, and smelling faintly of Mrs. Wellington's ginger cake and damp dog. "Hamish," she said, her voice like cool silk. "I heard about Julian Vane Temperley. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. I suppose you've been out in this wretched weather trying to make sense of it." "Ah, Priscilla," Hamish sighed, removing his cap and trying to flatten his unruly red hair. "It's a mess, a blue, blinking mess, and now Blair has arrived from Strathbane, shouting enough to wake the dead, and dragging poor Archie MacLean off to the cells for no reason other than he was the first person he saw." Priscilla stepped closer, her perfume, something light and floral, momentarily drowning out the scent of wet wool. "Blair is a fool, Hamish. We both know that. But Julian wasn't exactly a saint. My father couldn't stand the man. He called him a cultural tomb raider. Julian had a habit of buying up old Highland. Estates not for the land, but for the libraries and the artefacts. He'd strip them bare and sell the history to the highest bidder in London or New York." Hamish leaned against the mantel, grateful for the heat. "He had a bit of music in his hand when he died, Priscilla, a fragment of a score. Mrs. Wellington says he'd been fighting with a Mr. Latimer, a conductor staying here. Do you know the man?" Priscilla's expression turned serious. "I know of him. Arthur Latimer is a legend in certain circles, though a tragic one. He's obsessed with the Silent Carol, a lost masterpiece by a 19th century Highland composer named Malachi Macrae. Legend says Macrae wrote it while starving in a croft during the clearances. It's said to be the most beautiful piece of music ever written, but the original manuscript disappeared decades ago." "And let me guess," Hamish said, his hazel eyes sharpening. "Julian Vane Temperley bought the Macrae estate." "Exactly." Priscilla nodded, taking a small sip of her sherry. "Julian bragged at a dinner party last month that he'd found a hidden cache of papers in the cellar. He hinted that he'd found the Silent Carol, but had no intention of letting the world hear it. He wanted to keep it as a private investment. Latimer was there, Hamish. I saw his face. He looked as though Julian had admitted to kidnapping his child. It wasn't just professional jealousy. It was a deep, ancestral pain. For a man like Latimer, Julian was committing a sin against the soul of Scotland. Hamish looked down at Lugs, who had fallen asleep by the fire. So, we have a man who loathed the victim, a stolen piece of national history, and a murder scene decorated like a cheap disco. It's a bit theatrical for a simple grudge, is it no? Latimer is a conductor, Hamish, Priscilla reminded him softly. He lives for the theatre. He sees the world in movements and crescendos. She reached out and touched Hamish's arm, a gesture that made his throat go dry. Be careful. Blair will be looking for a quick win, and Latimer is a man who has lost everything but his pride. That can be a very dangerous combination. Hamish nodded, the weight of the investigation pressing down on him again. He didn't want to leave the warmth of the fire or the comfort of Priscilla's presence, but he knew the conductor was somewhere in the hotel, perhaps even listening to the wind and dreaming of a silent melody. He had to find Latimer before Blair's heavy-handed tactics destroyed any chance of finding the truth. He replaced his cap, gave Priscilla a lingering bittersweet look, and turned toward the stairs. His lazy routine was a distant memory. The Highlands were singing a dark, cold song tonight, and he was the only one who knew how to listen to the gaps between the notes. As he climbed the stairs, the sound of a piano began to drift from the drawing room, a slow, mournful tune that felt like a funeral march for a man nobody liked, played by a man who had every reason to kill him. The music led him to the drawing room, a cavernous space filled with heavy velvet curtains and the smell of stale potpourri. Arthur Latimer sat at the grand piano, his silhouette jagged against the dying embers of the fire. He was a man made of sharp angles and deep shadows, his fingers dancing over the keys with a frantic, desperate energy. He didn't stop when Hamish entered, nor when Luggs began a thorough inspection of the legs of a nearby Louis XIV chair. Hamish waited, leaning against the doorframe, his hands buried deep in his greatcoat pockets. The tune was haunting, a melody that seemed to capture the very essence of the lonely hills outside. The sorrow of the wind, the weight of the snow, and the silence of a house that had forgotten how to be a home. It was the sound of a heart breaking in a cold climate, and it made Hamish feel a sudden sharp pang of loneliness for his own small fire and his own quiet hills. The silent carol, Latimer whispered, his voice cracking as the last note faded into the stillness. He didn't turn around, or what remains of it. A ghost of a masterpiece, murdered by a man who saw only ink and parchment, never the soul behind the notes. "You're the policeman, aren't you? The one who looks like he's lost his way to the sheepdog trials." "PC Hamish Macbeth, sir," Hamish replied mildly. "And you'd be Mr. Latimer. It's a fine bit of playing, though it's a bit sad for the festive season, is it no?" Latimer finally turned. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with red, and his hands trembled as he rested them on his knees. "Festive? There is nothing festive about the desecration of art, Constable." Julian Vane Temperley was a Philistine. He held the only complete copy of Macrae's Genius and intended to let it rot in a vault. I begged him. I offered him everything I had. He laughed. He told me he might use the parchment to light his cigars if the mood took him. He was a monster who collected beauty only to hoard it away from the world. Before Hamish could respond, the heavy doors behind him were kicked open with a violence that made the crystal chandelier shiver. DCI Blair marched in, his face now a shade of purple that suggested an imminent medical event. He was clutching a clear evidence bag as if it were a trophy. Behind him, Anderson looked weary, clutching a notebook with limp, damp pages. "Step aside, Macbeth," Blair bellowed. "I've got him." I knew the handyman was too small a fish. This is the one. The temperamental artist with a motive as big as the Ben Nevis. He thrust the evidence bag under Latimer's nose. Inside was a distinctive hand-stitched leather glove lined with rabbit fur. "Recognize this, Mr. Latimer?" "Found it right under the synthetic tree snagged on one of those blue lights. It matches the one you've got stuffed in your pocket right now. You're coming with me." Latimer looked at the glove, then at his own pocket. He pulled out the mate to the glove, his face turning a ghostly grey. I must have dropped it. I was there, yes, I went to see him one last time. To plead. But he was already dead. I panicked and ran. "I didn't kill him. Save it for the station," Blair barked. "You killed him in a fit of pique, stole the music, and thought you could hide behind your fancy London reputation." "Anderson, cuff him." Hamish watched the scene with a bored expression, but his mind was racing. He looked at Latimer's hands, long, delicate, and visibly twisted with the onset of severe arthritis. Then he looked at the glove in Blair's bag. He moved closer, squinting at the leather. "Pardon me, sir," Hamish said, his voice dripping with feigned hesitation, "but that's a very clean glove for a man who's been tramping through 6 inches of Highlands slush. There's no a speck of salt or mud on it. And if I recall, Mr. Latimer here has a bit of a limp in his left leg. If he'd been struggling with a man of Vane Temperley's size in the snow, he'd have left a trail, would he know? Furthermore, that glove has been sitting in the hotel's lost and found basket by the front desk since yesterday morning. I saw it myself when I was looking for my own missing woolen mitten. Someone didn't drop it tonight, sir. Someone stole it from the lobby to leave a trail that even a blind man could follow. It's a red herring, Chief Inspector, and a clumsy one at that. You're being played like one of Latimer's pianos." Blair's face went from purple to a mottled, sickly white. He looked at the glove, then at Hamish. The silence in the drawing room was so heavy it felt as though the snow outside had found its way through the ceiling. "Stolen?" Blair whispered, the word carrying the threat of a physical explosion. "Stolen from a basket? You're telling me, Macbeth?" that I've been leading a manhunt based on a piece of charity shop knitwear. It's leather, sir, Hamish corrected gently, his eyes fixed on the fire. But yes, someone wanted you to find it, just like they wanted Julian. Found with that bit of music, it's all very orchestrated, if you'll pardon the pun. Blair didn't say another word. He turned on his heel, his coat flapping behind him like the wings of a vengeful crow, and stormed out, followed by a frantic Anderson who was already trying to phrase the error in the official log. Latimer collapsed back onto the piano stool, burying his face in his gnarled hands. Hamish didn't stay to offer comfort. He had a theory, and it didn't involve grand music or international fame. He whistled for lugs and stepped out into the freezing night. He didn't go toward the estate. He walked toward the manse, the home of the Reverend Wellington. He remembered something Priscilla had said about cultural tomb raiding. Julian hadn't just been buying music, he'd been buying people's pasts. He found the Reverend in his study, surrounded by old ledgers and the ticking of a clock. The minister looked up, his face lined with a fatigue that went beyond the late hour. "Hamish, I suppose you're here about the tragedy." "I'm here about the music, Minister," Hamish said, sitting uninvited in an armchair. Julian was going to do more than just hoard that carol, wasn't he? He was going to publish a tell-all about the old families. The Reverend sighed, his hands trembling as he closed a ledger. Julian enjoyed the power of the secret. He found something in the McCrae papers, something that would have destroyed the reputation of one of our most beloved residents. It wasn't about money, Hamish. It was about shame. Shame is a powerful thing in the Highlands, even more so at Christmas. What did he find? The silent carol wasn't just a song, Hamish. It was a confession. Malachi McCrae didn't write it in a croft. He wrote it in the village jail, while waiting to be transported for a crime he didn't commit. He had been framed by the very person who then became the hero of Lochdubh, the great-grandfather of our own Mrs. Wellington. The family's legacy there, standing in the church, their very moral authority, was built on a lie. Julian was going to include the original trial documents in his book. He was going to expose the rot at the heart of the village history. Hamish felt a coldness in his stomach. He thought of Mrs. Wellington in the shop, offering him ginger cake with a motherly smile. She had been invisible in the investigation because she was the personification of village stability, but Julian was going to strip that away. He was going to turn the minister's wife into the descendant of a thief. The music in his hand, Hamish mused, it wasn't a clue left by the killer. It was a trophy. A message. The song is over, and the secret is safe. He stood up, his mind clicking into place. The professional knots, the knowledge of the estate's wiring. It all required someone who moved through the village like a ghost. But Mrs. Wellington couldn't have done it alone. She was a frail woman. She needed a pair of strong, capable hands. Hands that knew the estate because they had been there to fix things a dozen times. "Archie," Hamish whispered, his voice heavy with a sudden deep regret. Archie wasn't the killer. He was the tool. Mrs. Wellington had played him like a finely tuned instrument, convincing the simple man that they were protecting the village from a Sassenach devil who wanted to destroy their way of life. It wasn't about a past grudge or a hidden affair. It was about the desperate, petty need to maintain a social facade in a small town where everyone's business was everyone else's gossip. The motive was as small as a cup of tea, and just as bitter. Hamish knew now that the trap he had to set wouldn't be for a conductor, but for the woman who had fed him dinner. The silent killer was the one who spoke the loudest about morality, and Hamish would have to be very careful to ensure the truth didn't end up buried in the Highland peat, alongside Julian Van Tempele's expensive garish orange jacket. The cold air outside the manse was a sharp reminder that truth, much like the Highland winter, had a way of cutting through the thickest of woolen coats. Hamish stood on the gravel path for a moment, his breath hitching in the gale, while lugs leaned against his shins, seeking whatever warmth the tall policeman had left to give. He knew now that Archie MacLean wouldn't say a word to Blair, not because he was guilty of murder, but because he was guilty of a misplaced ancient loyalty. In a village like Lochdubh, where the minister and his wife were the keepers of community morals, a request from Mrs. Wellington was a divine command. To Archie, protecting that name wasn't a crime, it was a duty. Hamish looked up at the darkened windows, feeling a profound sadness for the Reverend, a man of God sheltered from the devilish pragmatism of his own wife. He began to walk back toward the village shop. The lights were still on, a defiant yellow glow. As he pushed the door open, the bell chimed with its usual cheer. Mrs. Wellington was there, polishing the countertop with a rag, her movements calm. She looked up, her eyes behind her spectacles sharp as mountain spring water. "Back again, Hamish? I thought you'd be tucked in your bed. Has that man from Strathbane finally found a way to blame the snow for the murder?" Hamish sighed, a long whistling sound. He leaned against the post office counter, his cap held loosely. "Ah, Mrs. Wellington, it's a weary business. Blair has his mind set on the conductor, and I suppose it's for the best. It'll be a quick trial, and the village can get back to its peace. But I'm a bit troubled, so I am." Mrs. Wellington paused, the rag hovering over a spot of spilled jam. "Troubled? And why is that, Hamish?" Hamish lowered his voice. "It's those papers of Julian's. Blair thinks that little scrap in the man's hand was all there was. But when I was looking through the library earlier, I found the rest of it. The whole manuscript. It's a messy thing, full of old names and dates. It looks quite official, actually, like a legal confession or some such nonsense." He watched her. For a second her knuckles turned white, but her face remained a mask of matronly interest. "A confession? In a piece of music? That sounds like the ramblings of a man with too much time, Hamish." "That's what I told myself," Hamish lied, his tone dripping with deceptive stupidity. "I didn't want to bother Blair with more paper. So I just tucked the whole bundle into the old wooden coal box on the back porch of the estate. I figured I'd pick it up in the morning and decide if it's worth the ink of a report. It's probably just old grocery lists, but I'd hate for the wind to blow it away." Mrs. Wellington went back to her polishing, her movements more hurried. "The coal box on the porch, how very sensible. But won't the snow get to it?" "The lid is heavy enough," Hamish replied, stretching with a wide yawn. "Anyway, I'm off to the hotel for a nap in the lobby. Mr. Johnson won't mind. I'm far too tired to go back to the estate tonight. If someone wanted those papers, they'd have to be mad to go out in this storm to find them." He turned to the door. "Good night, Mrs. Wellington. I'll see you in the morning for my papers and perhaps a roll for my breakfast." As he stepped out, Hamish's lazy expression vanished. He began a wide path back toward the estate. He knew Mrs. Wellington wouldn't sleep knowing that the evidence of her family's sin was sitting in a coal box. She would have to go. Because Archie was in a cell, she would do the heavy lifting herself. He just had to wait in the shadows of the old garden, enduring the cold until the killer revealed themselves by trying to bury the past one last time. It was a simple trap, built on the vanity of the self-righteous, and Hamish Macbeth was prepared to sit in the freezing Highland snow for as long as it took to watch the trap snap shut on the woman who had fed him ginger cake while her hands were still cold from a brutal murder. He knew the cost of silence was high, but the cost of the truth would be even higher for Lochdubh. He simply waited for the night to end, and for the shadow to arrive in the garden of the dead man. The snow would cover the truth no longer after this long and very dark Christmas Eve night. The frost was no longer a guest. It had become an intruder, burrowing through the layers of Hamish's thick tweed trousers and settling into the very marrow of his bones. He was crouched behind a sprawling, skeletal rhododendron bush at the edge of the Varney Temple lawn, his tall frame folded into a shape that felt entirely unnatural. Beside him, Lugs was He sat her down and made a pot of tea, the routine act providing a shield against the reality. As the kettle began to whistle, a sound that felt like a scream in the stillness, Hamish picked up the telephone. He knew exactly how this had to play out. If he turned up with the minister's wife and a solved mystery, the chief constable would be pinning a commendation on his chest by breakfast. A promotion led to a grey desk in a grey city, a fate Hamish Macbeth feared. He needed to be seen as the lucky bystander, the bumbling village bobby who stumbled into a win choreographed by his superior. He took a deep breath, smoothing his hair and settling into his role. "DCI Blair? It's Macbeth here, sir. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I've had luck." "Well, it was your inspiration. Remember how you said the killer would return to the scene?" "You were so right, sir. I just sat where you told me to roughly and wait for someone to show. And would you believe it? Mrs. Wellington showed up to burn some papers. I managed to stop her, but I'm out of my depth with the legalities. I need your expertise to wrap this up properly before the press hears a single word." The arrival of the squad was a whirlwind of slamming doors and orders. Blair, seeing the opportunity to salvage his reputation, moved through the kitchen like a conqueror. He took one look at Mrs. Wellington, who remained silent, and then at the iron poker Hamish had placed on the table. "I knew it," Blair lied, his chest swelling beneath his damp overcoat, until he looked like a prize-winning pigeon. The profile I developed pointed directly to a local with high moral standing. "I told you, Anderson, didn't I? I said we needed to watch the perimeter. Macbeth here just followed my lead and held the fort until I could get here to make the arrest." "Absolutely, sir," Hamish chimed in, his face a picture of admiration. "I was just boots on the ground for your strategy. I wouldn't even know how to file the warrant without your guidance. And I suppose Archie MacLean can be sent home, since your theory about the accomplice was so spot on?" Blair waved a hand, already thinking of the headlines. Yes. Anderson, call the station. Tell them to release the handyman. He was just a pawn in my investigation. I'll take the statement personally. Macbeth, you've done adequate work. For once, you didn't trip over your own feet." Hamish watched as they led the woman away. He felt a pang for the Reverend, but his mission of self-preservation was complete. He had successfully handed the collar to a man who would scream its success, ensuring no one would suspect the red-headed policeman of being anything more than a fortunate simpleton. Silent Carol would remain a dark legend, and Hamish Macbeth would remain exactly where he wanted to be. He caught Priscilla's eye as she pulled up. She gave him a knowing smile, a look that suggested she saw through every layer and respected him more. Hamish just adjusted his cap, looking as though he was glad the night was over. He turned toward his dog, whistling low. "Come on, Lugs, let's go home." He stood in the doorway, watching the flashing blue lights fade into the grey dawn breaking over the loch. The silence followed was heavy, a thick Highland blanket that seemed to absorb the night's violence. He knew that by the time the sun was high, the village would be a storm of gossip, but for now, it was just him, the cold air, and the quiet satisfaction of a job done well. The sun began to bleed over the horizon in a bruised shade of violet and gold, casting thin shadows across the fresh snow covering Lochdubh. The storm had finally spent its fury, leaving a world that looked deceptively peaceful, as if the violence of the night had been a fever dream. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly down the street, his hands deep in his pockets. Lugs trotted beside him, invigorated by the morning air. Behind them, at the estate, the circus was packing up. Blair's loud voice echoed as he climbed into his car, already rehearsing his speech about the capture. Hamish didn't look back. He felt a profound sense of weariness that no amount of sleep could touch. The fall of Mrs. Wellington would shake the village. She had been the moral compass of Lochdubh for decades. To find out that her pride was rooted in an old lie, and that she was willing to kill to protect a family name, was a blow the community would feel for years. Hamish sighed, his breath a cloud in the air. He had protected his position, but at the cost of the village's innocence. It never felt particularly clean. He reached the Lochdubh Hotel as the first smoke rose from the chimneys. The door opened, and Priscilla Halberton-Smythe stepped out in a heavy sheepskin coat. She looked at Hamish, her eyes searching his tired face. "It is over then?" she asked. "Blair is taking her away to the cells." "Aye, Priscilla," Hamish replied, stopping by the wall. "He's taking the credit too. He is convinced he is the finest detective in the north. I am just the lucky lad who happened to be standing by the coal box when the truth fell right into it for him." Priscilla smiled, a small curve of her lips. "You are a terrible man, Hamish Macbeth. You would rather look like a fool than move to a city. But tell me, did you find the real Silent Carol? Or was it just a bluff to catch her out tonight?" Hamish pulled a yellowed bundle of parchment from his pocket. It was fragile, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. He looked at the notes of the man who died in a cell. "I found it in the cellar. Julian was right, it is a masterpiece. It is the sound of the Highlands. I have not decided what to do with it. If I give it to a museum, the historians will dig into the story and the Wellingtons will be ruined again. If I burn it, a piece of our history is lost." "You won't burn it," Priscilla said, stepping closer. "You are too much of a romantic for that, even with your lazy skepticism. Give it to Mr. Latimer. Let him play it once in the kirk, and then let it be forgotten. A silent carol for a silent village to remember." Hamish nodded, the idea settling well. "Maybe you are right. A bit of music to heal the hurt. I am going home, Priscilla. I have a pot of coffee that needs attention and a fire that has been neglected for too long. Lugs is hungry for breakfast. Good night, Hamish," she called out, "or rather good morning to you." Hamish waved a hand and continued his walk. He reached the station and let himself in, the familiar smell of old paper and damp dog greeting him like an old friend. He kicked off his boots, hung his cap on the peg, and set the kettle on the stove. He didn't think about the trial or the press, or the arrival of a new arrogant Sassenach who would eventually buy the estate and start the cycle over. He simply sat in his chair, Lugs resting his head on his knee, and watched the water begin to simmer. He had survived another Highland mystery, he had kept his job, and he was exactly where he belonged. As the first cup of coffee warmed his hands, Hamish Macbeth finally allowed himself a small, weary smile. The village was safe, the secret was quiet, and for the first time in 3 days, the Highland air was truly and peacefully silent. He leaned back, the steam rising in the quiet room, content to be the lazy policeman of a village that would never truly know how much it owed him for his silence and his very long, very cold night in the deep winter snow. He was back in his routine, far from the city, exactly as he liked it best. The sun was up now, painting the loch in shades of silver and steel. He reached for a biscuit, shared a bit with Lugs, and closed his tired eyes. Peace had finally returned to the village now entirely,